Under a wide Mesopotamian sky, long before the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Greece, people looked upward and named the powers they believed shaped their world. These powers were not distant abstractions, but living presences who moved through wind, rain, and starlight. In the earliest cities of Sumer, they were given a name that has echoed across thousands of years: the Anunnaki. The word itself means the offspring of Anu, the great sky father. In some texts, the name carries the sense of princely children, a divine assembly descended from the highest heaven. For the people of ancient Mesopotamia, this was not a single god, but a collective. The Anunnaki were the council of deities who presided over creation, order, and judgment. They were thought to inhabit the heavens, the earth, and even the shadowy underworld, present wherever the balance of life and destiny had to be decided. The culture that first spoke of them flourished in southern Mesopotamia, in the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Around the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, small villages grew into cities with names that still carry weight today: Uruk, Eridu, Ur, and Nippur. Here clay tablets were pressed with wedge-shaped signs, giving us the earliest written records of human thought. Within these records, we meet the Anunnaki, woven into hymns, king lists, and myths of beginnings. To understand them is to understand the imagination of a people who saw the universe as an ordered family. At the head of that family stood Anu, the serene sky god who embodied the overarching vault of heaven. Beside him, and often more directly active, was Enlil, the lord of wind and authority, a figure both revered and feared for his power to bestow kingship or unleash destruction. Another prominent figure was Enki, the god of water and wisdom, who moved with cunning and compassion, often mediating between divine decree and human survival. These were not the only gods of Mesopotamia, but they anchor the story of the Anunnaki. Why do these names still matter today? Partly because the myths in which they appear are among the oldest stories ever written. They reveal how early people grappled with timeless questions: where life came from, why suffering exists, and how the divine relates to the human. The Anunnaki were imagined as architects of the cosmos and judges over both gods and mortals. In some traditions, they brought order to creation, while in others, they presided over the fates of the dead. The variety of their roles shows how central they were to the Mesopotamian vision of existence. Equally fascinating is the endurance of their memory. Even after Sumerian culture gave way to Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires, the Anunnaki continued to appear in new guises. They were remembered in different languages, reshaped by different storytellers, yet always carrying with them the aura of ancient authority. Their persistence across centuries shows that the Anunnaki were more than a passing belief. They became part of a cultural foundation that influenced vast stretches of the Near East. The evidence we have for them is fragile, yet astonishing. Thousands of clay tablets, broken and scattered, recovered from ruined temples and palaces, carry their names. Hymns carved into these tablets describe offerings and rituals performed in their honor. Mythic tales, such as the descent of Inanna or the flood stories of Atrahasis, set the Anunnaki as decision-makers in moments of cosmic crisis. Even the Sumerian king list, a record of rulers stretching back into mythical time, presents kingship as something handed down through divine decree. Everywhere the human story and the divine assembly are interwoven. So as we begin our journey through their entire story, we stand at this dawn of names and sky. The Anunnaki are more than figures in myth. They are a window into the earliest attempts to explain a complex world. To follow their tale is to trace the arc of human imagination itself, from the banks of the Euphrates to the quiet of our own reflections tonight. And to do that, we must turn now to the clay tablets and ancient myths that preserve their voices, waiting patiently across millennia for us to listen. The story of the Anunnaki comes to us not from living voices, but from the silent surfaces of clay. Thousands of tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform are the only reason we know their names at all. These tablets were not made to survive. They were routine records, hymns, contracts and myths written for the people of their own time. Yet by chance, many were baked in ancient fires, hardened and hidden in ruins, where they lay for thousands of years until modern excavators uncovered them. Some of the most important discoveries were made in temple libraries. At Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, scribes carefully copied and stored sacred texts. In Nineveh, centuries later, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal gathered tablets from across Mesopotamia, creating one of the earliest known libraries. Thanks to these collections, we can still read fragments of Sumerian hymns, Akkadian epics, and Babylonian rituals. Out of scattered pieces, scholars have pieced together the story of the Anunnaki. Among the earliest references are the Sumerian god lists. These were essentially catalogues of the divine world, naming and ranking the many powers that governed existence. They included the great sky god An, the ruling figure Enlil, the clever water god Enki, the mother goddess Ninlil, and many others. Within these lists we find the term Anunnaki, describing a larger group of deities often associated with the offspring or assembly of An. The word marked them as a collective, not a single being, and their roles shifted depending on which text we read. In myths of creation, the Anunnaki sometimes appear as the builders of order. They are described as setting the foundations of the world, fixing destinies, and assigning duties to gods and humans alike. In other traditions, particularly in later Akkadian texts, they are pictured as judges of the underworld, seated in council to decide the fate of souls. This dual image, both creative and judicial, shows how flexible the concept of the Anunnaki could be. They were less a fixed pantheon and more a category of powerful divine figures whose exact nature depended on the context of the story. Some of the richest material comes from narrative myths. In the story of Inanna's descent to the netherworld, the Anunnaki appear as stern judges. When the goddess arrives stripped of her powers, it is the Anunnaki of the underworld who decree her death. In the Atrahasis epic, which tells of the creation of humanity and a great flood, the Anunnaki are portrayed as part of the divine council that grows weary of human noise and decides to bring destruction. Yet within the same tradition, Enki intervenes to save a remnant of humanity, showing how different gods within or around the assembly could take different roles. Later works in Babylonian tradition also preserved the memory of the Anunnaki. The Enuma Elish, a grand creation epic recited in temple rituals, describes the younger gods overthrowing the primeval chaos represented by Tiamat. While the focus is on Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, the Anunnaki are still named as important divine figures whose destinies are bound up with the cosmic order. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story once again places the Anunnaki as key voices in the Council of Gods, highlighting their role in decisions that shape the human condition. Reading across these works, we notice that the Anunnaki never remain the same. At times they are celestial powers who fix the stars and seasons. At other times, they sit in judgment beneath the earth. This shifting identity may seem confusing, but it reflects the fluid nature of Mesopotamian religion. Cities had their own traditions, and scribes often rewrote older stories to emphasize local gods or political agendas. The Anunnaki, as a collective, could be adapted to many roles without losing their aura of authority. Interpreting these sources is not always straightforward. The tablets are often damaged, with whole lines or columns missing. A story may survive in several versions, each slightly different depending on the time or region in which it was copied. Translation itself poses challenges, since the ancient languages contain words and ideas with no exact modern equivalent. Scholars must weigh fragment against fragment, building careful reconstructions while acknowledging the gaps that remain. Yet even with these challenges, a coherent picture emerges. The Anunnaki, were remembered as a divine assembly, linked with creation, destiny, kingship, and judgment. Their presence across so many centuries of writing shows that they were never a minor detail. They were central figures in the imagination of Mesopotamia, invoked in rituals, stories, and royal inscriptions. Every time we read their name on a tablet, we glimpse how ancient people tried to place themselves within a universe ruled by powers greater than themselves. The survival of these words is remarkable. They were pressed into wet clay by hands long gone, baked by accident in fires that destroyed the cities that wrote them, and buried beneath layers of dust and earth. Now they rest in museums and archives where modern eyes can read them again. Out of this silence the Anunnaki speak, shifting across myths and centuries like actors in many plays, always present, always powerful. As we move forward, we will look more closely at the divine family surrounding them. The great figures of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, whose actions define so much of Mesopotamian myth. To understand the Anunnaki fully, we must first understand the gods who stood at the center of their world. To understand the Anunnaki, we must also meet the great figures who stood at the heart of their world. Ancient Mesopotamian religion was not a collection of separate stories, but a vast family tree of gods, each one tied to natural forces, cities, and destinies. These deities were remembered not as abstract principles, but as personalities, with relationships, rivalries, and moods that shaped the lives of mortals. At the summit of this divine family was Anu, the Sky Father. His name meant simply heaven, and his power stretched over the vault of the sky itself. Anu represented ultimate authority, a presence so vast that he was rarely portrayed in action. In most myths, he is not a central character, but a background figure, the source of legitimacy for all the other gods. Kings claimed their rule through his favor, and divine decrees gained weight when tied to his name. He is the distant father whose word established the order of heaven and earth, yet whose hand rarely moved in the stories preserved to us. If Anu embodied quiet authority, his son Enlil embodied active command. Enlil was the god of wind, air, and authority. He stood as the central figure in many traditions, a king of the gods who directed the fate of both divine beings and human realms. Enlil could be a benefactor, granting kingship and prosperity to cities, but he could also act with harshness. In flood traditions, he is the one who decides that humanity must be swept away because their noise disturbs the gods. His character is stern, commanding, and sometimes implacable, yet essential for maintaining cosmic order. For the Sumerians and later cultures, Enlil's temple at Nippur symbolized the center of religious authority. Balancing Enlil's sternness was Enki, also known in later Akkadian tradition as Ea. Enki was the god of water, wisdom, and craft. His domain was the subterranean freshwater ocean that nourished the earth, but his influence extended to knowledge, magic, and the arts of civilization. Unlike Enlil, Enki was often portrayed as compassionate and clever. When Enlil decreed the flood, it was Enki who warned a human hero, guiding him to build a vessel and preserve life. In creation stories, Enki played a vital role in fashioning humankind, often shaping them from clay and imbuing them with the breath of life. His wit and subtlety made him both a trickster and a benefactor, a god whose laughter hinted at hidden wisdom. Alongside these three stood other important deities. Ninhursag, also called Nintu or the Lady of Birth, was the mother goddess associated with fertility, mountains, and the creation of life. In some accounts, she worked with Enki to form the first humans, binding together divine essence and earthly clay. Inanna, known later as Ishtar, was the goddess of love, war, and political power. Her stories reveal her boldness, passion, and complexity, from triumphant victories to her perilous descent into the underworld. Ninurta, often considered the warrior son of Enlil, embodied martial strength and the defense of cosmic order. Nergal, associated with the netherworld, brought plague and death, yet also ruled as a king below. Together, these figures filled the divine stage on which the Anunnaki appeared. The Anunnaki themselves were often imagined as a council, a collective of gods gathered to deliberate. They were not limited to a fixed number, but represented the assembly of divine powers descended from Anu, or allied with his authority. In some myths, they appeared as celestial beings, assigning destinies and guiding the order of the universe. In others, they sat as judges in the underworld, deciding the fate of souls after death. The texts sometimes distinguish them from the Igigi, a separate group of younger gods associated with labor or service. This distinction reflects the layered and complex theology of Mesopotamia, where divine categories overlapped and shifted with time. One story illustrates the interplay between these divine personalities. In the Atrahasis epic, when Enlil resolved to destroy humanity with a flood, it was Enki who quietly resisted. Speaking through dreams, Enki warned a human named Atrahasis to construct a great boat. Through this act of defiance, life was preserved, and after the waters receded, the gods established a new balance with humanity. Here we see Enlil as stern judge, Enki as sly protector, and the Anunnaki as a divine council enforcing decisions of cosmic weight. When we think of these gods, it helps to imagine them less as remote abstractions and more as a family. Anu is the distant father, Enlil the stern brother whose word carries weight, and Enki the cunning uncle whose cleverness often bends fate toward mercy. Around them circle mothers, sisters, warriors, and rulers of death, each one a character in the grand drama of Mesopotamian myth. This divine family is not only the background for the Anunnaki, but their essence. The Anunnaki were the assembly that embodied these powers together, shaping the world in which humans lived. To follow their story, we must keep these gods in mind, for every decision, every creation, and every judgment was shaped by their voices. As we move ahead, we will see how these gods and their assembly gave rise to humanity itself. Out of clay, water, and divine will, the first humans were fashioned, and the relationship between mortals and gods was set in place. The myths of Mesopotamia did not imagine humanity as an accident. Instead, people were placed into the world with a clear purpose: to serve the gods. At the heart of these traditions stands the Anunnaki, the great assembly who guided creation and judged the destiny of mortals. The Atrahasis epic describes how the gods themselves once carried the burden of labor. They dug canals, raised embankments, and maintained the ordered world. In time, this toil grew heavy, and the younger gods rebelled against their endless work. The divine council met to resolve the crisis, and a decision was reached. A new race would be created, one fashioned from Earth itself, to take on the work that the gods no longer wished to bear. This new creation was humankind. The imagery of creation is vivid and tactile. In some accounts, the mother goddess Nintu or Ninhursag shaped clay into human form. Into this clay, she mixed the blood or essence of a slain god, binding together earth and divinity. With her hands, she molded the first bodies, soft and fragile, and with divine breath she quickened them into life. In other versions, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, played the guiding role, providing knowledge of how to form beings capable of survival. These stories emphasize the union of material and spirit, of clay shaped from the riverbanks and life sparked by the touch of heaven. The purpose of this creation was clear. Humans were to labor in the fields, maintain the temples, and provide food and offerings so that the gods might live in ease. This arrangement was not only practical but sacred. Worship was viewed as a form of sustenance, with sacrifices and rituals keeping the divine world satisfied. In return, the gods provided order, fertility, and protection. The relationship was one of exchange, service and devotion from mortals, blessing and stability from the divine. Yet the balance between gods and humans was not always peaceful. The very noise of human life was sometimes described as disturbing the gods. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity multiplied until their clamor reached the heavens. Enlil, the god of authority, grew impatient with the constant sound and sought to reduce their numbers. The Anunnaki, gathered in council, agreed to send disasters to curb the human race. Plagues and famines followed, and when these measures proved temporary, the decision was made to unleash a flood to cleanse the earth. The flood narrative is one of the most striking elements of Mesopotamian tradition. In both Atrahasis and the later Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods send waters to wipe out humanity. Yet not all the divine powers were in agreement. Enki, often portrayed as sympathetic to humankind, warned a chosen man to build a great boat. When the flood came, this vessel preserved life, carrying people and animals through the storm. After the waters receded, sacrifices were offered to the gods, who, hungry from the absence of offerings, gathered around the smoke in acknowledgement of human survival. In these stories, the Anunnaki appear as both architects and arbiters. They create humanity to solve their own problem of labor, and later they judge humanity harshly when it grows too loud or disruptive. They are at once benefactors and overseers, shaping existence but also enforcing limits. Mortality itself is explained through this arrangement. Humans were not given eternal life, for endless labor would have made them equal to the gods. Instead, suffering, toil, and death became part of the human condition, a boundary that kept mortals in their place. Behind these myths lies a profound reflection on the human role in the cosmos. People are portrayed as essential, yet subordinate. They provide service that sustains the divine order, but they live under the constant judgment of higher powers. The stories echo questions that remain timeless. Why do we work? Why do we suffer? Why must life end? The answers offered in Mesopotamia placed responsibility within a divine bureaucracy. With the Anunnaki as the council that shaped destinies, the clay tablets that preserve these myths remind us of the intimacy of these ideas. Creation was imagined in the texture of wet earth, in the breath that fills lungs, in the flood that sweeps away homes and fields. These images connect the divine with the immediate, binding cosmic decisions to the rhythms of human life. As we leave these stories of origin and flood, we turn next to the world humanity built in return. The temples, kings, and rituals of Mesopotamia reveal how the Anunnaki continued to rule, not only in myth, but in the daily lives of their people. To the people of Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were not distant beings trapped in myth alone. They lived in the rhythm of cities, in the bricks of temples, in the hymns sung at dawn, and in the power claimed by rulers. The great gods and their council were understood as present in the daily order of life, and every household felt the weight of their influence. The temple stood at the heart of this connection. Each city was thought to belong to its patron deity, and the temple was the god's house on earth. Towering ziggurats rose above the plains, built layer upon layer of baked clay, their steps leading upward as if to reach the heavens. Within their courtyards, priests and attendants carried out daily rites. Offerings of bread, beer, oil, and incense were set before the images of the gods. Hymns were chanted to honor their names, and sacrifices renewed the covenant between human and divine. To keep the gods satisfied was to ensure that the rivers flowed, the crops grew, and the city endured. The role of the priests was essential. They stood as mediators between mortal and immortal, trained in sacred knowledge, chants, and rituals. Through them, ordinary people reached across the unseen veil to serve and honor the Anunnaki. The act of feeding the gods with offerings was not seen as symbolic alone. It was practical, a way to sustain the divine order, just as humans themselves required food and drink. In return, the gods were expected to provide protection and prosperity. Kingship was another arena where the Anunnaki loomed large. Rulers presented themselves as chosen by the gods, their authority flowing from divine will. In inscriptions, kings claimed to be appointed by Enlil, endowed with wisdom by Enki, or beloved of Inanna. The Anunnaki as a collective often appear in royal texts as the assembly that conferred legitimacy. Without their blessing, no throne was secure. Festivals and processions often displayed this relationship, with kings acting as stewards of the divine order rather than mere political leaders. To govern was to serve the gods first, and through them, the people. Visual culture reinforced this presence. The gods were depicted with clear symbols that marked their identity and power. Horned crowns signified divinity, a detail that distinguished gods from mortals in art. Some were shown with wings, emphasizing their command over realms beyond human reach. Hybrid forms combined human figures with lions, bulls, or eagles, reflecting the mingling of natural forces within divine beings. Water streams flowing from vessels symbolized fertility and blessing, while mountains beneath their feet represented cosmic authority. These images, carved into reliefs and stamped into cylinder seals, were not mere decoration. They were constant reminders of the gods' nearness, woven into the fabric of daily life. The Anunnaki were not only linked with the heavens and the earth above, they also ruled in the realm of the dead. In certain traditions, the Anunnaki served as judges in the netherworld, seated in council to decide the fate of souls who passed from life. Death was not an escape from divine order, but a passage into another sphere where the gods held sway. Funerary rituals sought to honor these powers, ensuring safe passage for the deceased and favor in the underworld. The offerings given to ancestors were part of this larger pattern, maintaining bonds between the living, the dead, and the divine council that governed both. The influence of the Anunnaki did not remain confined to one time or place. Their motifs spread across the shifting empires of Mesopotamia, from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Assyria. Later kings continued to invoke their names, carving prayers into stone and inscribing victories with the assurance that the Anunnaki had granted them strength. The imagery of horned crowns, winged guardians, and cosmic councils endured for centuries, carried into neighboring cultures and woven into their own traditions. Every aspect of daily life reflected this divine presence. To plant fields was to honor the gods of fertility. To sit under the shade of temple walls was to rest in the house of a god. To serve a king was, indirectly, to serve the Anunnaki who gave him authority. Festivals, processions, funerals, and prayers all drew upon the shared understanding that the gods were both near and essential. The people of Mesopotamia lived in a world where the sacred was never far away, and where the Anunnaki were not just figures in distant stories, but active guardians, judges, and patrons of life. The continuity of these traditions shows how deeply the Anunnaki were woven into the civilization that revered them. They were cosmic yet civic, mythic yet practical, distant in the heavens, yet present in every loaf of bread placed on an altar. Through temple, king, art, and ritual, the Anunnaki lived on in the daily rhythm of Mesopotamian society, a reminder that to live well was to remain in harmony with the will of the gods. The names carved into clay outlived the empires that once bowed to them. Though the temples of Sumer crumbled and the courts of Akkad fell silent, the Anunnaki were not forgotten. Their echoes carried into Babylon, into Assyria, and into cultures that reworked and reshaped them for new ages. In Babylonian tradition, the Council of Gods retained its authority, but roles shifted. Some gods grew in importance, while others faded, absorbed into larger figures or adapted for new theologies. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, placed Marduk at the center, yet the idea of a divine assembly remained. The Anunnaki, once the highest powers in Sumer, came to serve as judges of the underworld or as a collective term for deities who maintained order. In Assyria, with its emphasis on kingship and empire, the imagery of divine sanction continued, and the memory of the Anunnaki lingered in the inscriptions that bound rulers to heavenly approval. Syncretism was natural. Gods were merged, renamed, or repurposed, but the underlying pattern of a divine council endured. Beyond Mesopotamia, faint traces suggest that elements of these traditions seeped into other cultures. The flood story, for example, so central to Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, found echoes in biblical writings. The image of a divine council appears in Hebrew texts, though transformed to suit new theological frameworks. Greek myths, too, carried the idea of generations of gods who shaped the world, quarreled, and judged humanity. None of these parallels should be read as exact copies, but they remind us that stories move with people, carried across borders, adapted to new languages and beliefs. The Anunnaki, through fragments and motifs, contributed to this wider inheritance of myth. For many centuries, however, the Anunnaki faded from direct memory. Their names lay buried under ruins and sands, written in cuneiform that no one could read. It was only in the 19th century that modern archaeology brought them back into view. Excavations in Mesopotamia uncovered clay tablets, temple libraries, and royal inscriptions. The decipherment of cuneiform unlocked voices that had been silent for thousands of years. Scholars began to reconstruct the pantheon, the myths, and the role of the Anunnaki in the ancient imagination. What was once a forgotten council of gods became again a subject of study, fascination, and wonder. In the 20th century, however, the Anunnaki found a second, more unusual afterlife. Reinterpretations began to present them in ways the ancient texts never suggested. Writers like Zechariah Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods, but extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth to mine resources and create humanity as a labor force. These ideas drew loosely on Mesopotamian myths, especially the stories of humans created to serve the gods, but reinterpreted them through the lens of modern science fiction. Such claims captured popular imagination and entered the stream of ancient astronaut theories. Yet mainstream scholarship is clear. There is no evidence in the tablets for spacefaring visitors. The Anunnaki belong to the realm of myth, not to the annals of astrophysics. Still, the persistence of these modern reimaginings reveals something important. The Anunnaki continue to inspire because they address questions that are timeless. Where do we come from? Why do we suffer? Who or what governs the world? Ancient Mesopotamians answered with stories of a divine council that shaped humanity and judged its fate. Modern interpreters, even when straying into speculation, are drawn to the same questions. The myths remain a mirror, reflecting humanity's longing to understand its place in the cosmos. As we close this journey, it is worth pausing in reflection. The Anunnaki were many things: creators of humankind, judges of the dead, patrons of cities, symbols of divine authority, and voices carried across centuries of storytelling. Their myths remind us that humanity has always sought to name the forces beyond its control, to place order upon the vast unknown. Whether one approaches them as ancient history, as literature, or as living myth, the Anunnaki endure as companions in humanity's oldest search for meaning. So let the story settle now, like dust drifting back onto clay tablets, resting in quiet museum halls. The voices of the Anunnaki have traveled far, from Sumerian scribes to modern readers. They invite us to wonder, to reflect, and to rest in the knowledge that questions of origin and purpose are as old as civilization itself. Close your eyes, as though beneath a wide Mesopotamian sky once more. The Anunnaki watch not as rulers now, but as memories, shimmering like stars that never fade.